I'm making this video specifically for the Indian students that are planning to come to Canada as international students. Hey everyone, it's your boy Saurabh. Here's a video that compares the Canadian English with the Indian words from Canadian English and their equivalent in Indian English at the same time. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So the first word is procrastination. In Canada, you'd call this procrastination, but in India, you call it time pass. In India, you'd wear slippers, but in Canada, you'd wear flip-flops. If you feel you're too tired and you don't want to go to class, in Canada, you'd call it skipping class, but in India, you'd call it bunking a class. So you cross the road. In India, you'd call it zebra crossing, but in Canada, you call it a crosswalk. The place where I'm walking right now, in India, you would call it a footpath, but in Canada, you'd call it a sidewalk. The device that heats water at your home every morning, in India you call it geyser, but in Canada you'd call it a water heater. Avoid using the word geyser because it actually means it's like a derogatory term for an old person in North America. The machine that takes you up and down from a building, in India you call it lift based on the British English, but in Canada you'd actually call it the elevator. Those times when your friends kind of force you to do something that you don't want to do or go somewhere that you don't want to go, in India you call it pressurizing, but in Canada you call it peer pressure. So when you're planning to come to Canada, in India you'd actually tell people that you're shifting to Canada, but in Canada you'd actually say you're moving to Canada. The back end of the car where you'd store all of your belongings while on a road trip or something, in India you'd actually call it a dicky, but in Canada you'd call it the trunk or the boot of the car. The spare tires that you have in a car, in India you call it the Stephanie, but in Canada you just call it a spare tire. The little box in which you pack your lunch and go to your school or work, in India you call it tiffin, but in Canada you'd actually just call it a lunchbox. When you do a lot of ratta, because that's how our Indian education system works, you actually call it mugging to learn a lot, right? But in Canada, you'd actually just call it memorizing. Well, technically, mugging in Canada is also a word, but it just means that, well, somebody pointed like a gun or a knife at you and stole all your money. That's when you'd say a mugging is going on or you've been mugged. So don't use that. The place where you'd share your accommodations with your friends, in India you'd actually call it a flat, but in Canada you just call it an apartment. Any lovers of bangan ka bharta in the house? Man, I love that dish. So bangan, or brinjal as we call it in India, would be called an eggplant in Canada. If you go to a Subway tomorrow and you order like a sub with your favorite stuff in it, and you tell the person to make you a sub with capsicum in it, he would be totally confused because in Canada you don't call it capsicum, you call it green pepper or bell pepper. When you are finished with your high school, college or university, in India you'd actually say you've passed out of a college or passed out of a university, but in Canada you'd actually just said you've graduated from the university. Passing out here actually means that you got way too drunk last night and you slept somewhere and you woke up somewhere you shouldn't have. The tiny thing that's attached to the end of a pencil that's so innocent that every child in India or Canada or anywhere in the world uses. In Canada, you'd actually call it an eraser, but in India, you'd call it a rubber. Now, I know people who are watching it from Canada are actually laughing at this, and people in India seem confused. That's because rubber in India means it's equivalent to eraser, but in Canada, it means a condom. If you're really mad at one of your friends for him being a complete idiot, in Canada, you just call him an idiot, but in India, you'd actually call him a duffer. This comes from a total English colonial legacy of India, but the place where you live with a bunch of other people and other houses in India is actually called a colony, while in Canada, that place is called a neighborhood. When you refer to as something as a colony, it just means that you're being a white imperialist person living back in the 1700s. So I'm really happy to say that this particular word is not there in the Canadian vocabulary, and it's for a reason. It's because people are really taken care of here. But in India, the word rag is actually the Canadian equivalent of bullying, in which you would be maimed, that's a harsh word. You'd be actually like taunted and made fun of for something you cannot change or just to trouble you. But that does not really happen in Canada. So when you need help in a subject or something, in Canada you'd actually say that you've gone for tutoring or something. But in India you'd actually say that I'm going to tuitions. Now, in the difference between this word between India and Canada is that tuition or tuition in India it means just a tutor, while in Canada it actually means the fees that you'd be paying to your college or university. Dropping it down to some of like the winter clothing, because in Canada you need winter clothing. This is the land of eternal winter. So the word in India that you'd use is muffler, but in Canada you'd actually say scarf, because the word muffler actually means what we call silencer in India. In Canada it's called a muffler. So don't say that you need to buy a muffler because it's too cold and you want something to keep your neck warm, is because people are going to get really confused, thinking, imagining, why in the world would you need an exhaust pipe to kind of keep your neck warm? The most common thing probably used in the English language is the little dot that is at the end of the sentence that indicates that it's the end of a sentence. In Indian English you'd actually say full stop, but in Canada you'd actually say period. So fun fact to all the Indian students, in India the word thrice is actually very common, but just to let you know, that's only used in Indian English and probably like South Asian English, is because in the rest of the world it actually say once, twice and three times, but in India you say once, twice and thrice, because you know we like to cut corners. I know this might be like a 90s kids reference, but the word you'd be looking for a special kind of short that you use on a very hot summer day that just let you be comfortable in India would be Bermuda, coming from the word Bermuda. But in Canada, if you say that, they would just think of the island that's like about 1,000 kilometers from here, and the word that you would actually be using in Canada would be just shorts. This is an older people reference and a younger people reference. So when you're making like a long distance call in India, you'd actually say, and believe it or not, you'd actually call it an STD call. I know some people in Canada are laughing, or some people in India who know why the slang is there are also laughing, is because STD in Canada or in like young people slang actually means sexually transmitted diseases, while in Indian, like old Indian English, it means standard trunk dialing. So don't make an STD call ever. So the place where you actually refuel your car, in India you'd actually call it a petrol pump, but in Canada you call it a gas station. If you do enjoy the occasional Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Fanta or something like that, in India you'd actually call it a cold drink, but in Canada you call it pop. So a conductor is a person in Canada who is like the lead in charge of an orchestra or a symphony, and who's the director of the way the music is going on during the whole performance. So the guy who's standing with a little stick in his hand or her hand and kind of like swaying away and telling people how to play music is a conductor. While in India, a conductor is actually a ticket checker. So if you're going on a bus or a train, there would be a person that comes and checks your tickets, and that's the conductor. So in Canada, when there is no electricity, which I have never experienced in my life, when there is no electricity, you'd actually call it a power cut. But believe it or not, in India, you actually call it load shedding. Don't ask me why I laughed at that. I'm not gonna tell. Hey there, it's a good day out there, eh? So Canadians are actually very well known to use the word "a" as a suffix on the end of the sentence to kind of indicate like a word like right, or isn't that true? Like, what do you think? But in India, we don't say "a," but we use an equivalent. We say "na." So it's a good day, na, or it's a bright day, na. So the very embarrassing kind of winter wear that you'd actually wear in Canada when it's actually really cold, like minus 40 degrees Celsius or something, is called a balaclava. But the same thing used for a milder winter back in India, where the temperature falls down to like 5 degrees to like 0 degrees Celsius, you'd actually call it a monkey cap. So basin is where you drop off all your plates, dirty plates, and wash your dishes and everything in India, while the same thing in Canada would be called a sink. A basin in Canada is actually like the water body that's formed at the end of a bay on the ocean side, which has a lot of water. That's actually a basin. So just to give you an example, in the city of Halifax, the Bedford Basin is actually at the end of the Halifax harbor, and it's like a place where the seawater gets stagnated, and that's a basin. So don't take your dirty dishes out to the Bedford Basin to wash it. The common place in the apartment where you and all of your friends or your family would hang out in Canada is actually called a living room, but in India is actually called a hall. So when you say a hall, from the Indian English perspective in Canada, people would assume like you're talking about this grandeur place with a lot of space and about 300 people would be sitting. That's a hall. the easiest translation in layman terms would be a concert hall. But a hall in Indian English is just like a living room. If you really have a sweet tooth and you're craving something that's like really nice and probably something that you could have with that hot cup of chai, in India you'd actually be having a biscuit, but in Canada you have a cookie. A biscuit in Canada is referred to as the bread that's used by chains like McDonald's and Tim Hortons, in which they serve their breakfast sandwiches in. So even though it's called a biscuit, it's actually not a biscuit, it's just a type of bread or bun. When you're out in Walmart and you're shopping, don't ask the person what a trolley is, because a trolley could be... Actually, the word trolley does not exist in the vocabulary of Canadians as far as I know, because the Canadian equivalent of the same word as trolley here is actually shopping cart. Turns out you're just hanging out after your class with your friend, but you end up telling someone that you're hanging out in the corridor. A lot of Canadians would actually not get that, because corridor in Canada means like the pathway that leads you down to a dungeon in like someone's basement or something. The correct word at this point would be to use the word hallway. And the last word is, in India, because there, as you know, there are different kinds of toilets. You have the Indian toilet and the Western toilet. You'd actually call, if you want to go to a Western toilet, you'd call it like you want to use the commode, but that word does not exist in Canada, is because we simply don't have different kinds of toilets here. It's just one kind of toilet, and they just call it a toilet. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. I certainly had a lot of fun shooting it, filming it, and researching about it. If you want a part 2, just let me know and I'll make a new one. And just before you go, let me give you a view of what this beautiful river, I think it's the Elbow River or the Bow River in Calgary, Alberta. I'm not sure, but let me give you the view actually. Take care and good luck with all of your future prospects, and thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe for more content regarding international students and their lives in Canada, and I'll meet you in the next video then. Take care.